My name is Anna Peñalosa. I'm Wing's Knowledge Management Coordinator, and I'll be your facilitator today. Before we start, just a few things. I'll tell you, you are being recorded, and the video for the webinar will be on Wing's YouTube channel. And about using WebEx, the platform we're using today. If you lose your internet connection, don't panic. You can just reconnect using the link we mailed you. If you have any audio problems, you can just go to the top menu on the audio settings and test your audio at any time. You are all muted automatically as you join the meeting to avoid background noise. If you have any questions during the presentations, you can either type them at the chat box on the right-hand side, the bottom right-hand side. And if you have a very pressing question or comment you'd like to make, you can always raise your hand and we can interrupt the presentation for a little bit for you to make a comment. So, a little bit about Wings, most of you know, but we are a network of almost 90 grantmaker associations and support organizations around the world. We are in every region and currently in more than 30 countries, representing over 22,000 philanthropic entities, grantmakers, foundations, and private social investors, and so on. And this diversity of our network is represented here today by 3 of our member organizations. Oh, here have our presenters today, and Hanna Surmatz from the European Foundation Center, Isabel Peñalosa from the Spanish Association of Foundations, and Katherine LaBeau about Counsel on Foundations. Hanna will give us an introduction about the topic and the work the EFC has been doing on the FATF. Isabel will give us, will tell us the story of the Spanish Association, how they've been working with that, and so will Katherine from the COF and how they've been dealing with the situation in the United States. Hanna, I'm going to pass it to you.
Yes, hello everyone. I'll just need to there is my presentation. Yes, so counterterrorism measures and NPOs, that's the topic that really kept us busy over the last years, and it's going to continue to keep us busy. Indeed, globally, we've seen the phenomenon of a shrinking space for civil society. And one of the drivers behind the shrinking space is indeed, or are indeed, counterterrorism measures. So today we want to talk about one of the drivers and who is really the driver behind counterterrorism measures. And that is something called, or an organization called FATF, Financial Action Task Force, which indeed is the most influential but least known multinational organization. So when I go to events or seminars and talk about FATF and I ask who has heard about FATF, and it's in NPO circles or foundation circles, it is hardly anyone has ever heard of FATF. So the purpose of this seminar, of course, or webinar is, of course, that from now on, you will all be aware and know more about the Financial Action Task Force.
And are you able to move your presentation?
I cannot move it right now, so maybe.
That's strange.
Can you hear me?
I'll do the first slide. Yes, and we'll do the first slide and then we can try it.
Yeah, good. So I hello?
Yes.
Okay, I can't see, I lost my connection here, I'm afraid.
Okay, and I'm on your first slide.
Okay, maybe you just click it through then, because I will probably have to go back and dial in again. But if you could just, if people can hear me, then I'll just continue, right?
Yes, you can just go on.
Okay. All right. So FATF is the intergovernmental body established at the G7 in 1989. And it has now 36 member states and the European Commission with 22 observers, the UN and the World Bank. It's always run by one presidency. Currently, that's Australia. And as of end of June this year, Korea will most likely take over. FATF is really the international standard setter for anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism matters. So it is the one that really drafts the guidelines. It is a very powerful tool. It is not a legislator, but it has the power of a legislator. Because, as you will see later on, it is implemented by over 180 countries worldwide. And why is it so powerful, even though not being a legislator? That is because it has mutual evaluation peer reviews, and it is so that all the governments wish to score very well and hence have an incentive to implement the FATF standards. So the next slide. What does FATF do? It issues recommendations, and these are now endorsed globally by over 180 countries. These recommendations, they have interpretive notes, and some issues also have studies on them. And some have best practice papers, which are so-called guidance papers for the governments of how they should implement the recommendations. On the next slide, there are some concerns around FATF, and one of them is that does FATF know the NPO sector? And the problem is that the government delegations involved in FATF, they are really made up of civil servants from Treasury, police, and other law enforcement agencies, financial intelligence units, tax authorities, and home affairs. It's only 2 governments which have really NPO regulators in the that they send to the FATF meetings, and that's Canada and the UK. So we see that from those decision makers, the FATF members, there's very little understanding and contact with NPO sectors. And if we now move to the next slide, the interpretative note. Or we start with recommendation 8 first. So there's 40 recommendations that FATF has issued, and one of them specifically addresses the NPO sector, and it singles out the NPO sector. So the recommendation 8 says that countries should review the adequacy of laws and regulations that relate to entities that can be abused for the financing of terrorism. And it then says that NPOs are particularly vulnerable and countries should ensure that they cannot be abused. So this is the one recommendation that addresses the NPO sector, and it makes clear that countries must implement measures to ensure that NPO sector cannot be abused. There is one interpretative note, which is providing already some guidance to governments. And this interpretative note was slightly revised in 2013, and it there recognizes the vital role of NPOs and states that measures adopted to protect the NPO sector from terrorist abuse should not disrupt or discourage legitimate charitable activities. So that has already been something that the NPO sector has been pushing for, that is that at least there is a recognition that the recommendation should not be used to disrupt or discourage legitimate charitable activities. Recommended measures for countries include that they should review the NPO sector, their respective NPO sectors. They should do an outreach to the sector, get into contact with their NPO sector. They should supervise and monitor their NPO sector, and information gathering and investigation should take place. The problem with the Recommendation 8 and the interpretative note is that indeed the wording is unclear and it needs more guidance. The definitions used both in the Recommendation 8 and in the interpretative note have led to misinterpretation and overregulation in many cases. So if we now go to the typologies report, which was published by FATF last year in June, there we see that the FATF is arguing that indeed there is a risk of terrorist abuse in NPOs, and they've been issuing a typology around it. The problem is that the research gathered in the typologies report is just based on over 100 case studies. And we know, of course, that our sector, the NPO sector, consists of millions of NPOs. Nonetheless, the 100 case studies that were identified, they help FATF to draft a typology and to identify different types of abuse. And those would be diversion of funds, affiliation with a terrorist entity, abuse of programming, support for recruitment of terrorists, and false representation and sham NPOs. The issue is, of course, that the case studies as such are anonymized. They are not publicly available, so many of the case studies included in the typologies report were also given by police forces or kind of information that is normally not accessible. We have been always arguing from the NPO sector side that the actual abuse is rather limited. There are only very few cases of abuse, and it's difficult to gather a typology just based on so few case studies. Currently, the Financial Action Task Force is working on a paper which is called Best Practice Paper, which is currently under review, and the NPO Coalition provided informal input into the best practice paper review, and the best practice paper is a paper that is normally should be giving guidance to governments how they should implement the Recommendation 8. The key concern is really what is the target of the best practice paper. According to the opinion of the NPO sector, it should be mainly providing guidance to governments, making sure that the governments do understand how they should implement Recommendation 8 so that there is no overregulation happening and no false interpretation happening. But the intention of the best practice paper, as we understand it now from FATF, is that it should potentially also provide guidance to the NPO sector. That was something that was well understood, but we made clear that indeed the best practice paper should provide no competence to the FATF to draft NPO self-regulation, because self-regulation would be for the sector to develop by itself. Clearly, the best practice paper should provide more guidance to governments. That is, that it should highlight good practice of how the Recommendation 8 should be implemented. And here we understand that it should, governments should respect the fundamental rights of association, assembly, and expression when they implement Recommendation 8. And that the key issues around Implementation 8 are that it has to always be a risk-based approach. That is, that the governments should review their NPO sector and then identify if there is a risk, or if actually the law, the hard law and the soft law already address the risk properly, then there may not even be a need for further action. And that is something that is being really the kind of the focus of the previous or recent discussions with FATF, is that this risk-based approach was not entirely clear to the governments who implemented the Recommendation 8. They were simply providing overall regulation targeting the whole NPO sector without going for a risk-based approach. Then, of course, proportionality is very important, that any measures undertaken to address a certain specific identified risk have to be proportionate to the risk they try to address. And throughout the process of implementing the Recommendation 8, there should be an outreach scenario, meaning that the government should reach out to their NPO sector, get the NPO sector involved throughout the process. When the NPO coalitions commented on the best practice paper review, and they sent comments in December 2014 and April 2015, the NPOs also stressed that indeed we do not agree with the assumption that NPOs are particularly vulnerable to terrorist abuse, and that in the long run, indeed, the documents should be revised to reflect this. The FATF engaged in a consultation process on the best practice paper. That was what we call a streamlined consultation. The Financial Action Task Force did not share the draft best practice paper with the wider NPO sector. It organized a meeting in March this year and invited some NPO representatives, but there was no willingness on the FATF to widely share a draft best practice paper. But they gave the permission to member states, to national delegations, to share it. And we then succeeded also to convince some national governments as well as the European Commission to share the draft best practice paper with respective sectors, so that indeed we were able to see the draft, because it's a bit difficult, of course, to comment on a draft paper that you have not seen. So now the Financial Action Task Force will have their plenary meeting in June, and they envisage to approve it at this next plenary meeting. And what are the implications for civil society of all of this? Indeed, the Recommendation 8 has turned out to be some kind of recipe for to some extent, repressive civil society regulations. According to a recent study done by the International Center for Non-for-Profit Law, some 50 countries have introduced restrictions on civil society, and many of them with a counterterrorism rationale behind them. Some governments potentially even use the excuse of that they have to introduce tighter oversight mechanisms because of the Recommendation 8 or because of the FATF measures. And indeed, the problem is that the governments do not always implement it in the right way. There is misunderstandings and overregulation happening because of sometimes the unclear wording of it. So we hope that the best practice paper now will help to limit some of these unintended consequences. Indeed, the problem also lies with the current evaluation system. As I had mentioned earlier, the FATF mechanisms are very powerful because countries are evaluated every 6 to 7 years, and here indeed the countries want to be compliant, meaning that the governments, they do not have an incentive not to overregulate, because they want to score well on the FATF listings and they want to be compliant. So that is one of the reasons why there is more incentive to overregulate rather than not to regulate enough. We've seen several cases of wrong implementation. Countries have not undertaken any risk analysis, or they have not done a targeted approach or no proportionate approach, meaning that they have simply overregulated the sector in some regions and countries. We also see that banks are becoming more risk averse. It's more difficult to get money across border in particular. So we know that some foundations could not transfer their funds across border. We see that we are to some extent also back to carrying suitcases with money into countries where simply official transfer channels are no longer available because the banks are becoming too risk averse. And certainly we've seen the implication that there's less funding going to certain regions and also to certain types of NPOs. Now, what are we, the NPOs, doing? Indeed, I mentioned before that there is an NPO coalition which is working to advocate for a change of the FATF regime. There's global and European initiatives, and the key organizations active in this process are the Charity Security Network, ICNL, ECNL, Human Security Collective, and EFC, and we've always seemed to join forces, of course, and issued comments and joint letters also with WINGS, with Daphne, with other key players and networks. We have created, or the NPO Coalition has created, an online platform, which you see the link there in the presentation, and you're free to contact it for further information. And in the long run, of course, we seek to reform the Recommendation 8 regime. Clearer guidance is needed to make sure that there is some kind of damage control, and the revision of the best practice is one of the opportunities, though we do not yet know how the final best practice paper looks like, and we have to wait, of course, for the June plenary to see more. We also formulated our ask built on the experience we had over the past years, where we've seen that there is more dialogue happening between FATF and the NPO sector, which is a very welcome development. That we said that we would like to see this dialogue between FATF and the NPO sector to be more formalized, because there is already a consultative platform for the private sector. And we would hope to see that a similar consultation, formal dialogue is really established also for the NPO sector. Then, of course, we also would like to see NPOs globally to be engaged at the country level in the risk assessment and in the FATF evaluation processes. And I think we'll talk about that a bit later when hearing also from the experience in Spain and in the US. In terms of what you as NPOs or networks of NPOs can do, I think the key issue is really that there should be stronger NPO coalition building to advocate for change. This is a key issue to make a strong advocacy at national level, and then to engage with your respective national FATF representatives and to make them aware of the issues that NPOs are facing because of the FATF recommendations and their implementations, because indeed the FATF representatives are not necessarily the ones that know the NPO and foundation sector. And the third point, of course, be involved in the country assessments, make sure that NPOs, that you sit around the table when your country is assessed, and that you are able also to be part of already the risk assessment in your country to make sure that you can influence the process in your country from the very beginning. And the last point are indeed the FATF evaluations. That is currently happening in all the member states. There is a peer review on an ongoing basis where the countries are then assessed of how well they do in implementing the FATF recommendations. And they are to some extent, in some parts also done by the regional FATF-style bodies. And every 6 to 7 years are countries evaluated. So you can download on the FATF website when your country is up for assessment. And there is now a change also in the way the countries are assessed. That is that while earlier on there was only the review of technical compliance with Recommendation 8 implementation, now it is also a review of the effectiveness. And what we hope to see is that indeed Also, cases of overregulation are taken into account in the assessment processes, because in the past evaluation round, we've seen that some countries which have been really rigid with their civil society and with their NPO sector, like Tunisia and Egypt, they were scoring very well and very high on the FATF agenda. So that is something that we expect to change slightly with the fourth round of evaluations. I would like to note, though, that the countries have experienced some difficulties in how this effectiveness can be measured, and I think we'll hear a bit later about Spanish experience on that as well. So this is a new process and a new methodology which is now only starting, and we will have to make sure that there are clear guidances also how these evaluations should be running with a new methodology. And I think I'll stop there. I think that's enough for introduction, and thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you so much, Hanna. That covered a lot of ground in such a short period of time. Thanks for that. And if you have any questions for Hanna, please do not hesitate to type them in the chat box, and then we can address them later at the Q&A. And thanks. And now, Isabel will tell us a bit about what they've been doing in Spain about it.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Hello to everyone. Well, I will explain, or I will talk a little bit about the Spanish process, not only with FATF evaluation, but also regarding the regulation and self-regulation of anti-money laundering measures of any kind. Well, we have to make a little bit of history, just a little bit, since 2010. In that year, a new Anti-Money Laundering Act was approved. And in that act, non-profit organizations were obliged as other entities, and they were they were obliged to preserve during 10 years registries with the identity of donors, individual or corporation giving money or resources of any kind, and the identity of beneficiaries, were they individuals or corporations receiving resources for free from the NPO. That was, a previous obligation, but we have to preserve the registries only for 10 years. Problem with this regulation was that NPOs have to gather formal identity, but not only formal identity of donors and beneficiaries, but also the real owner of these donors and beneficiaries, which is, not so easy, almost in the cases in that other beneficiaries are foundations on other organizations, because there are not companies, and in fact there are no owners, or in some cases there are not members. Well, anyway, that registries are not public. Okay, each organization has to have them, but you do not have to pass them to the authorities or public authorities or any kind of authorities. They just have to be at the disposal of public authorities in case it is required. Anyway, there are regarding NPOs in the law or in the 2010 Act. There are 2 articles regarding NPOs, but the rest of the Act is regards or establish other obligations for other persons or kind of entities. Anyway, in 2010, the first problems or doubts arise in the application, as I was mentioning, who is the owner of the donors and especially of the beneficiaries, if they are other NPOs in developing countries, special risk countries, etc. We had also some doubts about all the donation, little amounts, what we have to do when we start a fundraising campaign, etc., and so on, so on, so on. So from the first moment in 2010, the nonprofit sector complained to the Treasury with an adequate development of the new law. In 2012, the Treasury contacted the Spanish Association of Foundations, requiring us or asking us for some kind of information regarding the risk that the sector faces. What is called in the FATF terminology and in the terminology of public authorities are risk assessments. Problem is that in that moment and nowadays, the Spanish Association has many studies with data about the sector, mainly the foundation sector, not all the third sector, but anyway, we have other studies. But this data show the number of foundations, the economic dimensions, the areas in which the non-profit organizations are working, the countries of activity, and all that, but we do not have really a risk assessment of the third sector. It's what we call, I think in English we can use the same expression, the Achilles heels of the third sector. We do not have, I think I agree with Hanna, and that is one of the main issues. We do not have a risk assessment or almost a real risk assessment. We have some examples, good practice, bad practice, or the best practice, but we don't know how. We don't know how risk is or how risky is the non-profit sector, and we do not have a common methodology to do it. So, well, in 2012, we only give some kind of information to the Treasury. A little bit, well, I have to say that when we talk after the impact assessment with the Treasury, they show us that really, well, they say it, but they have not written it in any paper, that they found that risky NPOs in Spain were that NPOs that were working in risky countries or countries considered as risky by the FATF or by the OECD, but not the rest of the sector. A little bit later, in 2013, Spanish Treasury shares with the Spanish Association a first draft based on the FATF Recommendation 8 and the previous best practice paper that FATF approved. In that case, what we could share with the Treasury was that we found the draft. Well, we share it with some members, so we have 1,000 members. I have to say it. Anyway, when we shared the draft with our members, they found that that draft contained general and very huge principles, and they considered that there was a lack of concrete tools or concrete recommendations for implementing best practice, especially for reduced NPOs, which it states some recommendations, but at the end of the day, they do not give us recommendation 8 does not give any concrete tool or any measure to implement a concrete best practice. In all this time and during this process, well, I have to remember that we have a law, but we do not have a development, a concrete development of that law. Anyway, 2013, the best practice draft was approved by the Spanish Treasury. It is very similar to Recommendation 8 and to the best practice paper, the previous one. But anyway, they accept some amendments, but it stays as it was at the beginning. I mean, it's just a guide. It's not a law or a decree or any kind of compulsory text. We have to wait to April 2014. In that year and in the last spring, Spain passed the FATF evaluation. So in that case, well, we have, during this period, we have maintained a dialogue with Treasury and with other public authorities, and the dialogue was so good, but it was we did not have concrete results. Anyway, in April 2014, Treasury contacts AF again as a representative organization, as an umbrella organization of the sector, and also the FATF contacts an international developing NPOs just to go or to attend the meeting with the evaluators of FATF as representatives of the non-profit sector. In the evaluation, well, the Treasury or in general national authorities, they cannot talk to the sector, they cannot recommend anything to the sector. They just have to explain in general terms what questions are expected from us, but they cannot say what are we going to be asked about or which are the concrete interests of the evaluator. Anyway, as a general idea or as a general recommendation, the Spanish authority told us that the evaluation was supposed to be focused on self-regulation tools of the sector, and that FATF evaluations wanted some self-regulation tools or concrete examples of best practice in self-regulation measures. But in fact, when we attend and we met with the evaluations, many of the questions were on Spanish regulation of the third sector, on the NPO sector. Especially, they make many questions about the registry system, which is a public system, and they do not ask about so many self-regulation tools. They ask also some questions about the mission and the work of the Spanish Association of Foundation as an umbrella organization. For example, they ask how was our relationship with public authorities, what do we do to train our members, how we provide them about general information on the sector and on their obligations, and what kind of other activities we develop with our members. Well, the evaluation was okay. It was nice, I think, to meet the evaluators. They were 5 persons representing a U.S. Treasury. There was another person from Italy, another one from Argentina, and I think there was another one from UK. But anyway, are not the same in all the meetings. It was a little bit amazing because just a few days after having the visit of the evaluations, the regulation developing the Anti-Money Laundering Act that we were expecting since 2010, not only the non-profit sector, but also other sector, financial sector and others. Well, that regulation developing the Act was approved just a few days that the evaluators left our country. It was approved by our government because it was a decree. And this decree specifies some of the requirements contributing to have more clearance in the application of the law. But we were surprised because as far as many other entities applying this law, in the case of non-profit organizations, we are obliged since May 2014 to identify donors of more than 100 euros. We thought that they have missed 10, but no, that is correct. We have to identify donors of more than 100 euros. That means that, for example, financial entities, banks, and other entities, they have to identify the other part when the operation are of more than 1,000, and we have to do it when we have a donation of more, in cash or not, of more than 100 euros. Well, in between, in December 2014, the Mutual Evaluation Report of Spain, it was published, and you can consult it in the FATF website, okay? And you can see that the calculation for the Spanish evaluation is positive in the FAF perspective. But for us, it has contributed to develop a little bit more restrictive legislation. If you read the FAF, the Spanish evaluation, you find regarding Recommendation 8, non-profit organization, in Spain is largely compliant with R8. The non-profit sector in Spain includes foundation, association, and religious entities, each with a different status and subject to different preventive measures. The Spanish authorities have a sound understanding of the risk in the non-profit sector, and the requirements in place on non-profit organizations were recently expanded to give association and foundation specific. Anti-money laundering and counter-financial terrorism obligation, including adding to a previous requirement to identify all the beneficiaries and all donors of more than 100 euros. Nevertheless, some gaps remain in the requirements, so they consider that are some gaps that they are recognizing it. The main technical concern is that Spain has a very complex institutional system for the oversight of non-profit organizations with 8 national and 76 regional bodies. Well, you can read it all, but I mean that they conclude that well, our legislation is a little bit restrictive. I think they are recognizing it, but they consider it positive. And also, they do not have any opinion, I think, on self-regulation tools. In fact, they are evaluating the development of the legislation since 2010. After that, we have organized some of the, some seminars. We have had other meetings with the Spanish Treasury, and we continued advocating, as Hanna said, for change. Anyway, well, we are trying to amend some points of the legislation, but we also have to wait to the new BPP, the best practice paper. We have to wait to the new document or the new draft. But I think that one of the main issues or the main problems, as I said at the beginning, is that we do not have a real impact assessment or real data about the risk of the sector, because I remember that the Spanish authorities recognized in one moment that they only felt that there were risky organizations in those who were working in risky countries, but anyway, they did not specify any more or why or what kind of measure we can adopt. Anyway, well, the floor is yours, so if you want to make us any questions, I will answer you.
And thank you so much, Isabel. And would like to remind you that I'll share the presentations with all participants of the webinar later, so you have all the links provided by the presenters. Thank you, Isabel. Now we're going to the U.S. and with Katherine. Katherine, can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Great. Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Hanna and Isabel. That was fantastic background, and in fact, I will keep my part of this presentation relatively short because of all the invaluable information you've already offered. So I'm just going to talk briefly about what the U.S. NPO sector and specifically foundations are doing around the FATF Best Practices paper and other developments. The U.S. is actually having its evaluation later this year, so I'll talk briefly about that and our plan for action as well. So for about a year and a half now, I have been working with a U.S.-based NPO FATF steering group, along with many folks who are on this call globally who I know have been engaged in this effort for quite a while. And much of the activity in the U.S. has been spearheaded by the Charity and Security Network and the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law and other organizations like that. And the Council became heavily involved, like I said, about a year and a half ago And prior to that, we were not really engaged in FATF, and we were not, really weighing in on things like the best practices paper and recommendation 8. So we're very pleased to be a part of this and play this leadership role here in the U.S. And as part of this working group engaged with FATF here, we regularly meet with others who are U.S.-based and also with U.S. officials, with the Treasury officials who serve on FATF or who represent the U.S. In FATF meetings. And I just attended a meeting with them a week ago to get our final thoughts from U.S. organizations that they will bring to the plenary in June. And so we weighed in with a few thoughts on the final version of the draft that we were able to see, and we're very much looking forward to see what that final version looks like. Overall, we were fairly pleased with their efforts to incorporate many of the edits that the global NPO sector offered back in April, and so hopefully some of our continued feedback is incorporated in the June version. So as I mentioned before, the U.S. is about to be evaluated this fall and winter, and so thank you, Isabel, for speaking of your experience with that. And so we're doing a few things here to sort of prepare for that and to ensure that the evaluators understand and can hear from the U.S. NPO sector while they're undertaking their evaluation. So the first thing we're doing is we are comparing the U.S. counterterrorism laws and regulations to the FATF guidelines to, show where there's areas where perhaps the regulations are even too restrictive and there might be go above and beyond what the guidelines would require, to show where there's perhaps areas that are worth revisiting. And in addition to that, we are also going to be submitting a letter on behalf of U.S. foundations to the FATF Secretariat to be delivered to the evaluators, requesting that we are able to meet with the evaluators while they're here and raising some of the top-line concerns and issues we see with the current U.S. regulatory structure for counterterrorism that impacts grant making. And so we will be submitting that to FATF, to the evaluators at some point this summer while they're conducting their technical compliance assessment prior to when they actually arrive in the U.S. later this fall and winter, and when we will hopefully be able to meet with them. And we're working, the purpose of this letter is essentially to ensure that the Council on Foundations, as well as other U.S.-based groups, are formally involved in the process in some way and will have an opportunity to speak to the evaluators and for the evaluators to hear our perspective on these laws that govern us. And one of our concerns that I'll raise is whether how the U.S. regulators go about assessing risk for U.S. NPOs and grant makers, and currently the risk assessment or the risk model they use isn't something that's public, and so we want to ensure that whatever model they're using to assess the risk of the NPO sector, that it is actually proportionate and actually captures the real risk of diversion of charitable dollars. And so that's one concern we'll be raising. And so this is, in addition to monitoring the upcoming U.S. evaluation, we've also been monitoring the impact of FATF recommendations in other countries because many of our U.S.-based grantmaker members do work all over the world, and they've been seeing the impact of FATF-inspired policies, or recommendations rather, on their global work. And just for a few examples, recently in Mexico, we've seen there are two pieces of legislation that are impacting cross-border grant-making there. And the first is directly inspired by FATF, and that is the anti-money laundering legislation that requires very, very detailed registration and reporting on foreign funds received by Mexican organizations. And because of our proximity to Mexico, the U.S. proximity to Mexico, many of our foundation members do a lot of grant making in that country, and they were sort of caught off guard by these burdensome reporting and registration requirements that we've seen since this law went into effect. And it began to be enforced last year, so we're just now sort of seeing it play out and seeing how it impacts our members' grant making in Mexico. And there's some aspects of the law that are particularly problematic. For example, it requires, or at least there's some ambiguity around this, but it seems to require U.S. foundations to share copies of their staff's passports and other personal identifying information to Mexican authorities prior to doing any sort of grant making in the country. And this, this is obviously a concern to have this personal information provided to Mexican authorities above and beyond information about the organization itself. And this has had the impact we've already seen of, making it much harder for foundations to do work in Mexico and just, adding in additional layers of burden that organizations need to overcome before they can make those grants. And so we've actually requested, as one way to try to deal with this, that to serve as a convener between Mexican authorities and the U.S. Treasury officials to discuss these issues that our members are facing with their grant making in Mexico. And this is actually a role that the Council has played often in the past. We've met with visiting delegations from other countries and have played an intermediary role often with Treasury and other U.S. officials and these other delegations. And so we're hoping to start a dialogue with Mexico and the U.S. Treasury and how U.S.-based grant makers can better navigate and understand this new law. And so that Mexico example is just one that we've seen recently of, how FATF's recommendations play out in domestic laws and regulations that really do have the impact of restricting the flow of charitable dollars into countries around the world. And so, as the U.S. is evaluated later this fall, and as we can continue to see the impact of FATF policies in other countries, the Council will remain very engaged and, plans to weigh in at every opportunity that is given and work with others like Wings and like EFC and others on the call to ensure that the voice of grant makers is heard and that, we can facilitate enabling environment philanthropy rather than restrictive. So those are some brief remarks on what's happening in the U.S. and what the Council is doing, and I'm happy to answer any questions, and my contact information is also available on the final slide here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katherine, for a very interesting presentation. It's good to have a case about Mexico. It's easier to see how that plays out in practice. And it's interesting that both you and Isabel mentioned risk assessment and also self-evaluation that are issues that we all face. And also the role of infrastructure organizations in advocacy for larger issues that affect the wild, the whole sector. So I think the message here is that we should all follow the national processes very closely, so, and from the beginning. We had such great presentations that we're kind of running out of time, but if you do have any questions whatsoever, you can just email us. I will have Wing's contact information, and you can send us any questions, and I can just redirect them to our presenters today. As I mentioned before, I'll share the presentations, the PowerPoint presentations with you, and the webinars and recording. And the video is going to be on Wing's YouTube channel. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Katherine, Isabel, and Hanna, for joining us today for the great presentations. Thank you.